And I really believe in rewarding people who show up on time. So for those of you that don't know me, but I think I know most of you, I'm Trish Snyder. I'm a member of the Unitarian Fellowship here in San Miguel. And we've invited Laura Carlsen, who can give you a little bit more about her background, but I've introduced her a number of times because she's become a friend and she's a regular visitor for the Center for Global Justice and for Ser Mujer. Laura came here in 1981. That's the year Dick and I were married, so I know without doing the math in my head, it was almost 40 years ago. But she had a white scholar, 86? I'm lying. But anyway, she
you can't connect it to your anniversary.
Well, 1986, I'll have to change my bio. And she had a Fulbright scholarship to study women in economics in Mexico. Is that right?
Yes.
She's a journalist. She's a broadcaster. She's the director of the CIP Americas program.
Oops, I have another correction. We're not with the Center for International Policy anymore. We're sponsored by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, a recent change.
That's very recent, which means Laura is going to be traveling not just in the Americas, but around the world. So before I make too many more mistakes, let's welcome Laura. Are you ready, Laura?
All right, well, I was just going to give a quick overview. I didn't see what your reading material is, so I may be repeating some things, but hopefully we'll be able to kind of put them in order. Basically, as everyone knows, when this process began, it's imposed on the other countries by Donald Trump, who had made a campaign promise to renegotiate NAFTA, which he called the worst trade deal ever. A lot of us were kind of in agreement with that, but not for the same reasons. So then he began the process of renegotiation, and Mexico entered into it somewhat fearful of what could happen, because during the entire process there were repeated threats, which was part of the negotiation strategy, I think, to withdraw completely. Now, when NAFTA began, just to give you some quick background, the negotiations in '92 here in Mexico were very new to all of us. Nobody really knew what this was, and especially between such a developed country and underdeveloped country. And most of the sectors of, say, peasant farmers, indigenous people, small producers, workers in unions, were against the trade agreement, because you could see that it was structured to give benefits to transnational corporations, capital mobility, while at the same time not granting rights nor any kind of development compensation to Mexico. There was no possibility of stopping or even negotiating at that time. It was completely closed. It was different when we went into this renegotiation, because there was, again, very little possibility of having too much impact. And then the other thing was that, especially here in Mexico with the Mexican government, because they just wanted to get it over with. They were concerned about the instability it would cause in financial markets, the whole process of negotiation, and especially the threat of withdrawal. And there was a sense that after 20 years, it would be very difficult to call the whole thing off. We weren't prepared to do that, so there was kind of a damage control strategy on the part of those same sectors within all three countries that had formed alliances that have been strong at some points and weaker at others when there were certain moments in the process. And that's basically how people organized. Most of the organizing was done in the United States and with the Democratic Party in terms of what could be changed within the agreement. Almost immediately, the government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador went into the negotiations on the same terms that the Peña Nieto government had gone in, which is basically give the gringos what they want so we can avoid this turning into a disaster for our economy, especially as his new government was going into power, which was somewhat ironic because this is kind of the neoliberal model classically, the classic embodiment of it in a free trade agreement. And not a lot of that was changed structurally. What they did in the end was update a number of things in kind of pretty technical terms, like new technologies incorporated and that kind of thing that wouldn't have required really a renegotiation and a name change and everything. And they also, the Democrats did end up playing a major role. Essentially what they were looking for with an alliance with the trade unions, especially the AFL-CIO and the large coalitions of trade unions in the United States, was more labor rights and higher salary and better working conditions for Mexican workers so that they couldn't be forced to compete unfairly with US workers. This was quite an evolution because there was a time when, you know, US workers considered Mexican workers the enemy, and that was one of their major objections to free trade agreements. But in this case, over the years, an alliance built where all the workers realized that their real enemy in this process were the transnational corporations. And what they had to do is raise the level of especially collective bargaining for workers in all the countries involved. They actually made some inroads in this sense. They were able to incorporate both the environmental and the labor agreements into the trade agreement. You'll recall that they were side agreements before. And this isn't the first time that they've done that. They've started incorporating those into trade agreements since Peru several years ago in the Obama administration, actually. But it was important, it is important, because otherwise what happened was that any case that involved violation of labor rights or environmental rights and protection was automatically trumped by trade considerations. So we have a history of 26 years in which no case in labor or environment was actually adjudicated and got to the point of sanctioning a nation for violation of its own laws as an unfair trade practice. There's a possibility that with these in the agreement and the way that it's worded, that there could be cases brought saying that a nation is violating environmental rights to attract investment, which is unfair, or to exploit workers and benefit companies, and those kinds of cases that we've seen so often in the past, but that have never been brought to justice. The labor agreement also agreed to incorporate the International Labor Organization rules. Again, you know, that's good, and that's pretty complete set of rules for labor, but the distance between having something like that on paper and really applying it is far, and that's what we're beginning to see in criticisms that are already arising of the new agreement. They also agreed just quickly that 45% in the auto industry of the parts have to be produced somewhere where workers earn $16 an hour. This is major for Mexico because they currently earn like $4 an hour. So they're trying to figure out how they're going to deal with that. And that in general, wages have to come up in Mexico, and that they have to get rid of the protection contracts, which are union contracts that are signed by a fake union directly with the employer, which means that the workers can't organize a real union. There's no real representation in the workplace. So now there's this huge process of going through all these protection contracts, getting rid of them, and beginning new possibilities of real worker representation in the workplace. The labor reform in Mexico and the commitment of the current government is to get this done. However, it's a huge task, for one thing, bureaucratically, and for another, it just doesn't seem to be moving forward very quickly. In the context of the austerity measures that the Lopez Obrador government has imposed, there's great concern on the part of the Democrats, who worked really hard to change this agreement and put those kinds of clauses in, that they're defunding inspectors, they're defunding all the enforcement mechanisms, or a lot of the enforcement mechanisms that Mexico might have to make that a reality. So that's one of the red flags that's already on on the agreement as it goes into force as it went into force on July 1st. The other important things were that they got rid of these special tribunals in which a corporation could sue a country for loss of profits and loss of future profits if the country imposed some limitation on its investment. And for example, if the country said you can't have a toxic waste dump here when the process had already in some form started, because of environmental considerations, the company could actually sue the Mexican government and say, you made me lose money, and get paid by the Mexican government, which is something that was done because they took it to a special tribunal that had a tendency to rule in favor of the corporations, and it was above the national laws. Now they've gotten rid of that in every area except for oil and gas. And so that's considered a win by progressive forces in the United States that pushed hard to get rid of those tribunals. They also got rid of the dairy supply program in Canada, which is going to be a huge problem for Canada, and was actually a great example of how to create a reasonable, producer-friendly and consumer-friendly system of supply management from the state. And now, especially with the crisis, it remains to be seen how NAFTA is going to interfere with their ability to support their dairy sector. In general, I think this is the biggest criticism, and I'll finish with this, that it didn't change that export-oriented economy model. As we can see by the urgency that President Lopez Obrador felt to go to Washington in the middle of a pandemic, and some of you have probably read what I've written about this because I was just appalled, and support Trump during a re-election campaign, is a reflection that they're still banking on this export-oriented foreign investment model for the economy, and now as we enter an economic crisis, even more. And so you heard the two exchanging praises because of the fear of this government that unless there's a strong signal to international investors, they will flee from the anti-neoliberal discourse, which has actually been very scant in action. I mean, there's an announcement that we're in a post-neoliberal period, but we're not seeing evidence of that in the types of projects and the types of changes in economic reforms that are happening right now. But that in case this was scaring them away, that they were giving a strong message that Mexico is open for business to transnational corporations, that they're willing to accommodate them, and that they're going to do it through this new NAFTA. I think that was a real purpose of the tour. I think it was a miscalculation politically. I think it was, even though there's been praise for it in among his base particularly. And I think that it will have a cost in the long term because the problem with NAFTA, the first NAFTA and the second NAFTA, is that for a developing country, its dependence and its way of obliging a country to follow these free trade rules eliminates the kind of policy tools that a developing country needs, and especially needs in a crisis like we're up against right now. So that means that things like the New Deal, where you can do government procurement to foment your own industries when your economy is collapsing, where you, which would mean a suspension of most favored nation in NAFTA, we're locked into an agreement again that prohibits some of those measures from taking place, some kinds of fiscal reform, some types of measurements against capital flight. You can imagine a whole number of tools that could be quite useful during this crisis that may be very limited by NAFTA. There's still a lot of figuring out going on in terms of what you can and can't do under the old one and the new one, actually. But in general, there's a sense and a lot of evidence to show that these kinds of agreements are a straitjacket for poor and developing countries, and particularly when they have to confront a crisis like this one.
Thank you, Laura. I told Laura we needed her for about a half an hour because I know she has this new big job and she does a lot of other things. But I think we have some time for questions. It's just 11:46. And my question is, do you think the incomes or the salaries will rise as they're supposed to $8 an hour? Will that happen?
It depends in part on what time frame you're looking at, and also depends on what happens with the crisis. The commitment of the government, I think, is there. They want salaries to go up. And they want salaries to go up because there is a commitment to the poor, and to reduce inequalities within the country. It's really one of the top priorities of the government, and I believe it's genuine. And they also want them to go up because in order to pivot from this export-oriented model, like right now they're praising it because they think they need it at this moment. But I think there is a longer-term economic policy of moving away from it. In order to move away from it, what you have to do is you have to build up the internal market. And to build up the internal market, you have to build up not only domestic production, but also domestic consumption. And so by raising salaries, they'll do it. But they've been very clear that they're going to do it gradually. And, we have to see, so far it's been extremely gradual. It's like I think it was 16% that they did when they first got into office, and they doubled it along the border because they're trying to create a less of a gap right in that border area. And I'm not sure what the schedule, I don't think there's a set schedule of how that's going to happen in the future. So I think it will happen very gradually, especially now with the conditions, because they're going to have to be able to balance that between not putting businesses that are on the verge of going out of business, not pushing them over the edge, especially the smaller and medium-sized ones. I think the commitment's there, but the conditions are really kind of not.
I remember sitting on an airplane next to an engineer who was going to a carburetor convention, and he worked in Silao for one of the companies. And I said, so what kind of car do you drive? And he said, oh, I don't get paid enough to afford a car. But he's making everybody else. Anyway, I don't want to hog all the time for Laura's questions. Who else would like to ask a question? And unmute yourself when you do.
I guess mine was kind of related to Trish's on these on the wages. It seems like in at least one of the articles I've read, or a couple of them, there are a lot of ways to avoid this for companies themselves to, there's penalties they could pay. There's a lot different things they could do. They could fuss around with that 45% requirement. And I'm just wondering whether the structure is strong enough to really get a rise in wages.
Yeah, so there are two different things. Like the minimum wage, they technically, they can't avoid, because that's national minimum wage no matter what kind of a thing. But then this particular, the thing you're talking about, the 16% wage, the $16 an hour wage in the auto industry, in 45% of the content of a car that's sold, from here, they're already talking about how to get around it. There's some companies, they're saying we go out of business because they came down here based on cheap labor, and so what they're saying, we'd rather pay the tariff, because you can not pay your workers that and then pay an export tariff to export the car. And so some are saying that, and others are saying that they're going to have to ask for an extension. There's a lot of talk within the auto industry that there is not going to be total and immediate compliance with that particular rule. So we have to see how they react, how under the law, how they can react. And the people in the progressive forces, the unions in the United States, are already concerned about that as well. And they're also concerned about the collective bargaining, because there was a recent arrest of a lawyer, a labor lawyer, in the border area by the name of Susana Prieto, and she's been organizing unions and supporting union workers, and she was arrested by the state government. So now, you know, the people, the Democratic Party, the Democrats and the unions in the United States who pushed and said, okay, but it's got to be this way in terms of respect for labor rights. In Mexico, if we support this thing, are going, whoa, this is not looking good.
Maybe Andrea, who wanted this topic to be our topic.
Forgive me if I'm mistaken about this, but it was my understanding that in the NAFTA agreement, there were constraints about specifically about making whole items. I'm concerned about the limitations on innovation for the next generation and creating product, creating service. I don't have a clear understanding of how the original NAFTA set laws to prevent Mexico from creating a whole item, but only allowed it to make components. A mistake on my part, please correct me. And how is the new agreement different? Does it support innovation and creativity?
I'm not as familiar with that part of it. There's some additional support for that. Mexico's always had a big disadvantage on patenting. You know, if you look in the region as a whole, who holds patents, it's the United States, and in fact, they have their cases in which they've stolen patents from Mexico as well. Patenting tends to be an area, like most, in which the wealthiest and those with the best lawyers end up winning. So that's always been a problem. There isn't, as far as I know, a restriction on making whole products within either the old NAFTA or the new NAFTA. This idea of vertical integration, where part of it's made in the United States, then it comes down to Mexico, and part of it's made here, and then it's taken back to the United States for more work, and then sold there, and then it is bumped between all different countries, not even just the three in the agreement, but others as well, before the final product is produced, like an automobile, is really the result not so much of prohibitions or laws, but of, you know, corporations' calculations on what's going to, now that the whole world is their oyster, you know, with globalization, on what's going to give them the cheapest product and the highest profit margin. I think Mexico's problem as well is that it's coming into this game competing against well-established companies and imports, which has left it, and an underfunded government, especially now, which has left it with little room to really do the kind of development and research and development that they would need to do to become a leader in innovation and technology.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Of course, Cliff.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, how do you see the prospects for democratizing labor unions in Mexico? I understand that there's a 4-year period under the new NAFTA in which that's supposed to take place, but some 600 protection unions are filing legal challenges to that and are going to fight best they can to prevent democratization of unions. So how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, it's a huge problem how the courts have been filled with these cases of amparos or injunctions against the law. And then, as I mentioned, also just the work that's involved in the labor secretary reviewing all these contracts and determining which are protection contracts and therefore illegal. There's another problem in terms of, you know, it's a country that does not have a history or a culture of independent labor union organizing. There are very few, and so, you know, we could conceivably even end up with a situation in which they get rid of these and then they end up with new charro or they're unions that the traditional pre-unions were and are, because they're still very present, unions that make deals with employers, that bully employees into accepting contracts, that have party affiliation and political interest tied up with labor representation. You know, so we could see that it's possible, it's conceivable that that culture survives, and that we even see new players in the same culture, like say Morena affiliated or informally affiliated unions. You know, there's a real problem in changing the culture for that to happen. I think now, you know, the legal framework makes it more possible, but and there's always been a fight for justice among workers. You know, it's not that workers are willing to accept this situation. So there's a lot of desire for real representation, and of course for better living conditions throughout the country. It's going to be a lucha. It's going to be a battle.
Okay, I think we have time for one other question before our half hour is up, but doesn't mean we have to leave the chat group. But Laura, before you leave, is there a way that we can support your work? Is there a donation site or a link we can put up on the chat?
Yeah, thanks. So our work is at www.americas.org. It's real easy to find, and it's also real easy to find on the page a donate button through PayPal, and you can also use credit cards there. So lately we've been publishing less articles, but doing a lot more organizing, and there's some key pieces up there right now, like coronavirus in South America. We work with a group, it's almost all original material, and we work with writers throughout the region and with organizations. We've been working a lot now on binational immigration issues with organizations in the United States and Mexico, women in migration, a lot of immigration work actually, and some of these trade and US-Mexico relations issues. In particularly saying, in this case, you know, no, it's not okay to support, no matter how pragmatic you think you're being, you know, somebody like Donald Trump, not only because of what he does and has done to Mexico and to immigrants, but also because of what he represents in the world and in the United States at a time when people are demanding a new society there. So we did a lot of work around that as kind of a betrayal to the movements, both in Mexico and the United States.
Okay.
May I ask a question? Could you just summarize, has Trump really done any good, or has he done everything bad, or what? Can you summarize the new version of NAFTA versus the old one?
Oh, in this new version? Yeah, there's some advances in this new version. There's a few things that are not as good and even worse, perhaps, some intellectual property. And they managed to get out some of the worst stuff that was being proposed, like new intellectual property restrictions on medicines. The Democrats worked hard to get rid of that and some other things. But the labor stuff in general, the environmental stuff in general is better. There was a chance for it to be much more progressive. The Canadian government brought to the table some interesting proposals on having a gender chapter because of the unequal impact it's had on women, of having an Indigenous rights chapter, but of course those did not make it into the new agreement. So the agreement itself is a little bit better. This is the way I would sum it up. But the model continues to be extremely negative for people in general, that is to say workers, the poor, Indigenous people, small farmers, family farmers, and for Mexico as a developing country.
Short end, huh? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Alan, for the question.
I wanted to just add one thing, and that is, you know, they got rid of the term free trade in the title, because it is now associated on the far right with globalism, their critique of globalism, which is different than our critique of globalization, you know. But they got rid of the term North America. So now and those are conceptually important changes. They still talk about North America as a bloc, but basically what they're doing is saying, how can we three countries get together to defend against China and to create better conditions for corporations? And they're hoping, I mean, some people are hoping that better conditions for workers as well within this particular region. But the United States, anytime it gets close to a point where a significant and particularly a politically powerful sector could be affected negatively by NAFTA, they negotiate on the side like it didn't exist. And that's happened with sugar, it's happened with tomatoes, you know, it's happened a number of times. So the idea that this creates a one-size-fits-all set of rules for all the countries has historically and in the future will be false, because it still comes down to the vastly unequal power quotients of the partners that are involved.
So in the end, it'll be a little bit better for Mexicans. Will it affect people like us, expats who live here, or people in the States, where prices going to go up as wages go up? There
are a lot of different projections regarding that. There's a possibility that prices, especially in some of these sectors like the auto prices, will go up some as wages go up. In that case, though, we can look to other countries that actually have far better conditions for their workers and that are still competitive in the auto industry, like Germany. Because if you simply brought down some of those CEO salaries that are mega salaries, you know, you could pay this increase in workers' salaries among thousands. You know, so the actual what should happen, and what many people are hoping will happen, is that there'll be a redistribution of the wealth created by the industry. And so far, the projections are that the actual cost won't go up that much.
Thanks.
One last question. You know, in the U.S., when it's now going more towards robotics and manufacturing instead of paying higher wages, is that going to happen in Mexico too?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's the same corporations, so it's certainly a possibility. And there you get into a whole nother can of worms, as we say, you know.
Yeah.
What do you do with employment? Do you then have to go to basic incomes? Do you know, technology, you know, really drastic technological changes that could happen within the industry. I haven't seen anyway, you know, scenarios for how that all plays out economically. And yet it's a real possibility. So I think that's one of the question marks that still remains.
Okay.
You mentioned that the dairy industry was going to hit the hardest by this agreement. And I was wondering, what would be the worst case scenario?
Well, I was talking specifically about the Canadian dairy industry that had a supply management program, a state-run supply management program. And of course, for them, the worst case scenario is that they get inundated with US imports, and the dairy farmers in Canada lose their livelihoods. In Mexico, there's been a lot of imports as well. It's had a major impact on the dairy sector. And in all these, you know, the worst case scenario is that a lot of people lose jobs, and at a time when a lot of people are already losing jobs.
We have one more question. Mine is, I don't have a question. I would like to tell you to go to www.americas.org to find out more of what Laura does. And if you'd like to support her, I'm sure it would be welcome.
Yeah.
And I know you speak all around the world. And we're so glad you joined us this morning, Laura.
Well, thanks so much. And yeah, we would really appreciate it, because with the transition and everything, we're kind of trying to not get back on our feet, because the program has continued now for over 40 years, one of the only programs on U.S. relations in Mexico, in Latin America, and on social movements in the Americas that has been able to survive. And we're always kind of on the edge, so every little bit helps out a lot. Right now, in particular, because I had to take a consulting job because we don't have salaries within the program itself. So in particular, I'm trying to be able to assure at least a part-time position for someone to do kind of the nitty-gritty in the program, so I can do more of the analysis and the speaking and the sharing and the networking parts of it, the more political parts of it, and not be bogged down by that. I really need help. And so that's what we're aiming for right now. And anything you can help out with to get us there, I'm hoping in the next month or so, we'll be able to hire somebody else. It would be really appreciated.
I'd just like to underline one of the things that she mentioned, and that is the change in the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, ISDS as it's called. Under the original NAFTA, it was the case that any foreign corporation could sue the Mexican government for any action that affected their profits, present or anticipated future profits. And Mexico could be forced to compensate the corporation, transnational corporations. And those cases heard by a 3-person panel of judges, generally corporate lawyers. And so the whole thing was rigged in such a way as to really advantage the corporations. And cases were not heard in Mexican courts. But now, under the new NAFTA, that has been almost completely eliminated. Corporations can still sue Mexico, but they need to do it in a Mexican court under Mexican law. And so that's a big step forward. I know our Occupy Wall Street group here in San Miguel worked hard on that issue, and because that was part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement as well. Now, Mexico, under the new NAFTA, is not bound by that. However, Mexico is part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that has that investor-state dispute settlement mechanism still. So, for example, disputes between Mexico and Canada, a Canadian corporation could still sue under the TPP agreement. Actually, there are hundreds and hundreds of trade agreements that various countries have, and routinely they all have that provision still. So the new NAFTA is really a step forward in terms of how trade agreements can be framed in the future.
Is there anything we can do locally to impact that, or any? I mean, it seems so out there, and we're right here, right here in our houses. Are there any actions we can take, or letters we should write, or advice what we could do? Cliff, this is for you.
Well, I don't know. It's not really in our hands. I mean, the U.S. And Mexico, in their agreement, have already taken care of that issue, with one exception. And the ISDS still applies, as Laura pointed out, in the energy sector, oil and gas. The foreign corporations that have agreements basically are grandfathered in and can still sue under that old NAFTA provision, which means that the mobile or the BP stations that we've seen here in San Miguel will still be protected under that provision. But except for that, there's not much else that we could do. That I can see. I don't know.
Well,
I think it's more in the area of the protection contracts, that pressure from civil society can be significant.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.